Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this event sponsored by the School of Public Policy. My name is Andres Velasco. I'm the Dean of the school, and I am very, very happy to be welcoming to our school, our visiting professor, friend, Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford in California, Niall Ferguson. Welcome, Niall, to the LSE. So sometimes universities are faulted for addressing topics that are not in the headlines. This is a lecture which cannot be faulted for that. As I'm sure you're all aware, the title that Niall has chosen for tonight's talk is Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, Crisis and Conflict in the Context of a New Cold War. So pretty much every headline and every important issue in the world today in the course of 30 or 40 minutes. Thank you for that. So let me just say a little bit about the format and the rules of engagement before we get going. Please turn off your phones if your phone happens to be on, so as not to disrupt the event. The event is being recorded, and we will make a podcast out of this, presuming we get the tech right, which we often do. We will have a format in which we will give our speaker the time to make his presentation, deliver his lecture. Then I will use my privilege to ask him a few questions. We will sit in this somewhat cramped, but I hope comfortable pair of chairs. And needless to say, we will then have a chance to have a conversation with everybody in this room. And Carolina, if I'm right, with people also on Zoom, right? Wonderful. Okay. And when you do ask questions, please keep them brief so that, and ideally with a question mark at the end, so that we can get as many questions as possible. And if you're using Twitter, what used to be called Twitter, X nowadays, the hashtag for today is hashtag LSE Public Policy. So as the cliche goes, Niall Ferguson needs no introduction. But I will provide a brief one in contradiction with a cliche. As I mentioned already, he is the Milbank Family Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. He's also a Senior Fellow at the Belfer Center at the Kennedy School at Harvard, and a historian by training. He got his PhD at Oxford, and he has been on the faculty at Oxford, at NYU, and at Harvard before going to the other coast and joining Stanford. I had the privilege of getting to know Niall when we were both at Harvard. He was on one side of the river, shall we say the posher side of the river. I was at the less posh side of the river, but we became good friends nonetheless. And I think it is fair to say that Niall is a very accomplished historian. But in addition to that, he is a public intellectual and somebody who endeavors to leave a mark on public debates, not just on academic journals. And if you've ever seen him in action, a rather fierce debater and a very good speaker. And that's one more reason to look forward to tonight's events. So without further ado, Niall, the floor is yours. You take it from here, and then we will have a conversation. Welcome.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be back at the LSE. I was here 12 years ago as the Roman visiting professor, and so it was rather a thrill to return to the campus and not recognize any of it at all, because it all seems to have been completely rebuilt since I was last here. I'm going to speak for no more than 35 minutes about what I think is happening in the world. I'm a historian by training, but I'm visiting the School of Public Policy. So I'm going to use history to frame reflections on our contemporary world. And then we're going to have discussion, and then you get to ask difficult questions. I thought I'd come up with the term Cold War II 5 years ago, but it turns out there was already a movie with the title Cold War II. That's the poster. I haven't yet seen it, but it sort of captures some of what I want to talk about Let's see if this works. Not in the least. It's nice to be back in England.
We're in the UK.
Do you know, in Glasgow, they have the expression Disneyland, because this Disney worked and that Disney worked. So, there we go. When was Mike Tyson last quoted at the London School of Economics? Probably 12 years ago when I was last here. Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. These words came to me when I heard the Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore say to a group of us last week, every question is hypothetical until it actually happens. I actually consulted Mike Tyson some years ago, as this photograph confirms. Actually a highly entertaining person to talk to, rather to my surprise, and not as tall as I was expecting either. And the point I want to try and emphasize is that I'm going to talk about things that are hypothetical, but just because something's hypothetical doesn't mean it won't punch you in the mouth, and possibly much sooner than you expect. When I first started talking about Cold War II in 2018, I thought I'd better test the hypothesis by talking to somebody with a lot of knowledge of the First Cold War. And it's hard to beat Henry Kissinger when it comes to Cold War knowledge. He was graduating from Harvard when the Korean War broke out. He's now 100 years old. I'm in the midst of writing the second volume of a biography of Kissinger. We found ourselves together in Beijing in November of 2019. And I asked him, are we in a new Cold War? And he replied memorably, we are in the foothills of a Cold War. I thought that was a great headline. A year later, he upgraded it to the mountain passes of a Cold War. When I interviewed him for the Sunday Times last year ahead of his 100th birthday, he said something really striking. Quote, the second Cold War will be even more dangerous than the first, which when you consider how dangerous the first Cold War was, is rather an arresting thought. 40 years ago, I was an undergraduate at another university, and those were the days of A-bomb in Wardour Street. Fans of the Jam might remember that track. The thought of nuclear war was in fact very much in our minds. Many of my friends were in the campaign for nuclear disarmament. I wasn't. I celebrated the deployment of cruise and Pershing missiles. But that was a dangerous episode. The notion that we could have an even more dangerous Cold War is, I think, a troubling one. They say if it looks like a duck, swims like a duck, and quacks like a duck, and I guess tastes like a duck, it's probably a duck. How do you know when you're in a Cold War? What are the criteria? I've been asked that question so many times that I came up with this checklist. It was actually George Orwell in this city who coined the term Cold War in 1945, and he defined it as a peace that is no peace. The peace that was no peace between the United States and the Soviet Union was ideological, of course, but it was also technological. It was economic. When Khrushchev said, we will bury you, he meant economically. And it was geopolitical in the classical sense that there were certain zones of the world that the two superpowers contested. And I think if you ask about the current relationship between the United States and the People's Republic of China, it ticks all the boxes. Now, I'm not saying it's the same before anybody starts formulating a devastating question, any more than World War II was the same as World War I. They were pretty different, but nobody really argued that the Second World War wasn't the Second World War. It wasn't a debate topic. And I think Cold War II will soon very recognizably be Cold War II. And gradually it's becoming obvious that it's ideological. Particularly since Xi Jinping became China's leader, there is a very clear distinction drawn by the CCP leadership between what goes on in China and ideas in the West, rule of law, democracy, etc., that are fundamentally at odds with the Chinese way. It's not just about nuclear weapons and satellites, big technological bones of contention in the first Cold War. It's about 5G, AI, quantum computing, vaccines, hypersonic missiles. Actually, the technological complexity of Cold War II is one of its striking features. Economically, as I'm going to show you, this is a much tougher assignment for the United States because China is a much larger economy and a much more sophisticated economy. And China can talk about things that really the Soviets never had a chance to dream about. They can talk about their currency becoming a contender ultimately for reserve currency status. Nobody ever said that about the ruble, trust me. They can bid to make semiconductors as sophisticated as are made in democratic countries aligned with the United States. The Soviets could never do semiconductors. Chris Miller's brilliant book, Chip War, talks about why that was. And in this Cold War, as in the other Cold War, there are these geopolitical flashpoints, of which Taiwan is certainly the most important, but it's not the only one. Now, many people thought 20 years ago that economic interdependence would somehow lead to convergence between the United States and China. China would become more liberal politically, and we'd all live happily ever after in a win-win world. I was skeptical about that proposition, and in 2007, Moritz Schullerich and I published a piece in the Wall Street Journal, one of a series, but this was the first one, about Chimerica. We made the point that the United States and the People's Republic of China had sort of fused economically, but we argued this was a chimera. So the word chimerica was always a pun, and the idea was that this couldn't possibly last. And the reason that it couldn't possibly last, we suggested, was that the payoffs were very asymmetrical. China did the exporting, and the United States did the importing. China did the saving, and the United States did the consuming, and so forth. And the result was an absolutely huge imbalance in trade between the United States and China, which became so large that at one point in around 2014, China accounted for nearly half the total US trade deficit. One way in which this imbalance manifested itself was that China began to take manufacturing employment away from the American heartland on a pretty large scale. Another way it manifested itself was that the benefits of Chimerica disproportionately flowed to the 1% in the United States. They certainly didn't flow to the median household, which saw its real income stagnate from 1999 through until 2016. Now, what followed from China's admission to the World Trade Organization in 2001 was an acceleration in Chinese growth. And Americans suddenly began to notice that China was catching up. The Soviet Union's economy was never more than 44% the size of the US economy. On a purchasing power parity basis, that was as close as the Soviets got in the 70s. China overtook the United States on a PPP basis in 2014. It still hasn't caught up on a current dollar basis, and I don't think it ever will, by the way. But until recently, it was conventional wisdom at Goldman Sachs and everywhere else that the moment when China overtook the United States in current dollar terms was only a matter of years away. So one consequence of Chimerica was to create a more formidable rival than the United States had ever faced before. An even more striking consequence of Chimerica was to create a role reversal. At the beginning of the 2000s, Chinese manufacturing value added was about half that of the United States. Today, it's double that of the United States. This is one of the most striking charts in the world, if you ask me. Notice also that by comparison with the US and China, Russia's are kind of also around now. So a huge shift in global manufacturing occurred in the last 20 years. It was, to me, amazing that it took so long for Americans to notice this enough for it to be politically a decisive issue. I can remember shortly after I began teaching in the United States in around 2004, asking friends in the government department at Harvard, hey, where are all the protectionist candidates? There ought to be lots. And there was a bipartisan consensus that everything was awesome about Chimerica. And it lasted amazingly long. You can see the shift in sentiment towards China was really quite recent. That actually China's favorability numbers were pretty much okay until 2011. And the real spike in unfavorability is in the last 5 years, that period which I associate with Cold War II. Americans woke up to the Chinese challenge, and in complex ways. Partly it was that Donald Trump gave Americans permission to feel mad about the loss of manufacturing jobs, but it wasn't just that. And it wasn't just America. The really interesting thing about Pew's work on China's global image is that the deterioration in China's reputation has happened almost everywhere, almost but not everywhere, where Pew does survey work, in South Korea, in Japan, in Australia. You see it in Sweden. You see it in Canada and Germany. You see it in the UK. Huge shifts in attitude towards China, with only a few countries, Italy being one, where there hasn't been this big shift. That's, of course, because the Italians sell so many luxury goods to China that couldn't possibly stop loving their Chinese customers. I once asked a senator of a red state, why do your people, why do they feel hostile to China? He replied, Neil, it's simple. My people blame China for COVID. That was it. I think that's got a lot to do with it, actually. I think maybe people at elite educational institutions underestimate the extent to which ordinary Americans blamed China for COVID and all the disruption that it brought to their lives. And I don't think the Chinese government helped in 2020 with the wolf warrior diplomacy, which antagonized even European countries, much less likely to get mad at China than the United States. Another issue which I think is going to become more and more a part of Cold War II is climate. It's really difficult to have a rational conversation about this issue because there's a strong impulse amongst environmentalists in the Western world to blame the West for climate change. But actually, this is really implausible because North America and Europe have been reducing their emissions for years, but China hasn't. In fact, you can see from these two charts that China is responsible for 2/3 of the 32% increase in CO2 emissions since Greta Thunberg's birth, and 93% of the 39% increase in coal consumption. These are startling figures. I've long argued that one can't have a rational conversation about climate change unless we discuss how to curb Chinese emissions, and it must be said, increasingly Indian emissions. And that's a conversation that very few people in the environmentalist movement want to have. What they will tell you is, but China's investing immense amounts in green energy. But we end up in a world in which the West buys its solar cells and electric vehicles from China, where they're manufactured by burning coal. If you think that's going to save the planet, I have a tier 3 city tower block to sell you. So that's my setting, the Cold War II setting. And just as when Henry Kissinger was graduating from Harvard in 1950, a hot war broke out in Korea that revealed the true nature of the strategic bifurcation of the world, so in 2022, a hot war broke out in Eastern Europe that I think had something of the same effect. I do not believe that, Vladimir Putin would have launched the invasion of Ukraine had he not received a green light from Xi Jinping prior to the war. And I don't believe that it would be possible for Russia to continue its war effort in Ukraine without substantial exports of dual-use equipment from China to Russia, which goes straight into the Russian war effort. So for me, the significance of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February of last year is that it's the Korean War of Cold War II. Just to clarify the point, Cold War I was essentially transatlantic. And its key zones of conflict ranged from Berlin to Cuba. Cold War II is trans-Pacific. But that meant that in Cold War I, you could have the hot wars in Asia. You couldn't risk a hot war in Germany. The stakes were too high. But you could have a hot war in Korea or in Indochina. Well, in a trans-Pacific Cold War, the hot wars will happen in other places, like Europe. If the Korean War analogy is right, then a stalemate is exactly what was predictable at the outset. When my colleagues, Francis Fukuyama and others, were looking eagerly towards Ukrainian victory last year, I said, no, what happens here is you have a year of very kinetic warfare and then things grind to a halt and you end up with 2 years of attrition. And at the end of that, you probably get an armistice, but you don't get a peace agreement because there's no way of agreeing a peace. And then you get a dangerous border which persists. And that, I fear, is the most likely outcome of the war in Ukraine as things currently stand. By the way, if you look at this map, which is the Economist's latest map of the conflict, you'll see that we're well beyond the Ukrainian offensive, which was the summer. We're now in a conflict where the Russians are landing as many hits on Ukraine as Ukraine is landing on Russian-held territory. You wouldn't be in a Cold War if there wasn't a crisis in the Middle East. And it was almost too symmetrical to have almost to the day a surprise attack on Israel 50 years after the Yom Kippur War. That's what happened on October the 7th. And I believe that these attacks have created the most serious crisis in the region since 1973. We can perhaps talk more in the discussion about this. By the way, I like the flashing lights. It's really quite Saturday Night Fever. It goes with my three-piece suit. But John Travolta's was white. So I have the 1970s on the brain. Actually, in some ways, Israel's more strategically vulnerable than it was 50 years ago. I mean, if you look at the most recent vote in the UN on a ceasefire resolution, only 14 countries voted against it. Even more disconcerting from the vantage point of my Israeli friends is that sentiment in the United States, as well as in Europe, but the United States matters more, has shifted really markedly against Israel amongst younger people. This is causing consternation to democratic strategists because they're shocked to find a huge difference in attitudes between the generations. Generational politics is the key to most things in democracy today. I remember trying to make that argument in a book called The Cash Nexus. Here you can see it very clearly. The real divides in American politics are generational. The question is, now that we've had a crisis in Eastern Europe and one in the Middle East, neither of which is over, do we go the whole hog and rerun the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was the most dangerous moment in Cold War I, over Taiwan? And the great thing about this mirror image quality of Cold War II is that if we have a Taiwan semiconductor crisis, the United States gets to be the Soviet Union. Joe Biden gets to be Khrushchev. Think about it. In 1962, an island very close to the United States, Cuba, was blockaded by the United States. The Soviet Union retorted by sending a large naval and submarine force to run the blockade. It got extremely close to World War III, though nobody knew it at the time, because the Soviet sub-commander gave the order to fire a nuclear-tipped torpedo at US naval surface ships who had been depth charging. So they actually had been depth charging the Soviet submarines. And the only reason that torpedo wasn't fired was that by chance a superior officer was on the submarine that day conducting an inspection. They were completely out of radio contact with Moscow. And the superior officer cancelled the order. If he hadn't, World War III would have begun in 1962. Now, I can't understand why anybody would want to run that experiment again. If we did a Monte Carlo simulation of the Cuban Missile Crisis, we did 100 times. I promise you, there wouldn't be 100 times that World War III didn't break out. So it seems kind of odd to want to have another Cuban Missile Crisis, but we're doing that. We're doing it. Only the roles are reversed, because this time the island is off China, the other side, and it's the Chinese have the option to blockade. They're not going to invade Taiwan, it's blockade it. We know they can do that. They've already rehearsed the operation. They rehearsed it when Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan. And what then? Then any US president is in the position of Khrushchev having to send the Naval Expeditionary Force. Or what? Or cede the Indo-Pacific to China, convincing the Japanese that it's all over for the Pax Americana. Now, the fascinating thing about this issue is that American sentiment has shifted on this too, as you can see from this recent poll by the Chicago Council. If China were to invade Taiwan, would you support or oppose the United States imposing economic and diplomatic sanctions on China? Massive support for that. Sending additional arms, 2/3 of people support that. Using the US Navy to prevent China from imposing a blockade around Taiwan, that's basically 62, 63% of Americans. These are way higher numbers than in Cold War I, when Taiwan first really was an issue. So something remarkable has happened in American sentiment. Although it's come down since 2021. Notice this chart here. It's quite surprising. There's been a significant shift back from peak hawkishness in 2021. But still, Americans are far more ready to fight for Taiwan than they ever were in the 70s, 80s, 90s. At the time of the last major Taiwan Strait crisis, when Bill Clinton sent a naval expeditionary force, yes, Bill Clinton, to the Taiwan Strait, the issue was much less salient for voters. At the same time, the policy elite has jumped on this issue in ways that are truly remarkable. In 2020, during the pandemic, Richard Haas, Grand Panjandrum of the Council on Foreign Relations, published an article in Foreign Affairs calling for the end of strategic ambiguity, that the United States should no longer have an ambiguous position on Taiwan, which is, it's kind of one China, but we kind of might do something if you guys do something we don't like. That was the strategic ambiguity of the 1970s. And Richard Haas comes out with the article saying, let's be unambiguous. We'll defend Taiwan. And Joe Biden, the president of the United States, starts to say that too. 4 times. And each time, White House spokespeople have to walk it back. But if you say something 4 times and people walk it back, the walking back stops working. So we have had a significant shift in attitudes and policy stance. This is extremely dangerous, I believe, extremely reckless, because the United States is no longer in a position to do what Bill Clinton did. It would be incredibly dangerous to send 2 aircraft carrier strike groups across the Pacific, especially when 2 are currently somewhat busy in the Eastern Mediterranean, at a time when the US is already sending substantial armaments to Ukraine. It's far from clear, and the war games show this, that the US is really ready to be a successful deterrent force in protection of Taiwan. The reason that the United States is losing credibility with its deterrent capability is partly fiscal. And here I'm consciously steering the conversation towards my good friend Andres Velasco's economic interests. We read all the time of how strong the US economy is, how it's exceeded expectations this year. But of course it's exceeded expectations. They're running a 7% of GDP deficit at full employment. That's an astonishing number. So unbalanced is US fiscal policy that there is no scenario that the Congressional Budget Office can think of where the debt does not rise. And in 3 or 4 of the scenarios, it gets close to 250% of GDP by the middle of this century. That's Japan level. The US has an unsustainable fiscal policy. I've been saying this for years, and each year it gets worse. Now you slap on top of rapidly accumulating debt the biggest increase in real interest rates since Paul Volcker was at the Fed 40 years ago. Quite apart from the likely recession that this will cause next year, it creates a strategic problem because the US ends up being one of those great powers which spends more on debt service than on defense. One of my few general theoretical laws of history is that if you're spending more on debt service than on national security, you probably won't be a great power for very much longer. The problem with the showdown over Taiwan is that Cuba exported cigars. Taiwan exports the most sophisticated semiconductors in the world on which every major AI company depends. So if you have a war over Taiwan, or even the risk of a war over Taiwan, the economic impact will be 10x that of the war in Ukraine, which is pretty big, and probably 100x that of the war in Israel. If you don't believe me, read Bob Blackwell and Philip Zeliko's excellent paper that they did for CFR in 2021. By the way, that chart is a Taiwanese chart depicting the blockade rehearsal that the PRC conducted when Pelosi paid her visit to Taipei. I want to wrap with some good news. I learned over 20 years in the United States that you should never end on a note of Scottish despondency. The other side has its problems. The scale of China's demographic problems is kind of stunning. When the UN revised their population projections, it was startling to see that China's population base case, median case, halves between now and the end of the century. There's even a scenario in which the population of the United States could exceed that of China by 2100. This makes it very hard to sustain the growth rates that we've seen in China in the past 50 years. China doesn't have the fiscal levers that it had after the global financial crisis. That's because its public finances are in a shocking state too. Just takes a different form. As the IMF pointed out in its recent country report, if you take into account all that's going on local government balance sheets, the actual public sector deficit last year was close to 17% of GDP. 1/7. US 7, China 1/7. China's debt, once you include all the stuff that goes on at the local level, is as big relative to GDP as the US debt. Partly because of restrictions imposed by the Commerce Department last year, China's losing the AI race. At least that's the informed view in Silicon Valley, where I spent time for my sins. We thought 2 years ago that it would go the other way. It turns out doing large language models on massive scale is hard, and the US companies are doing it better. Let me leave you with something that is not quite good news, something that you might consider really rather bad news. Donald Trump, I've been saying this for over a year now, is highly likely to be re-elected, to have a second term. He'll be only the second president to have 2 non-consecutive terms. Who was the first? Correct. You can buy me a pint later. If you were watching, the New York Times published this poll just the other day. If you were watching closely, it's been obvious for some time that Trump's pulling ahead in the swing states. And the Biden administration can't catch a break. Full employment. Inflation's coming down. Everybody hates the economy. The Gallup poll of economic confidence is where it was in early 2009 at the depths of the financial crisis, before the recession that's likely to happen next year. This isn't good news, except in one respect. I actually think the Biden administration's foreign policy has been terribly bad, and they have been given a very easy ride. Despite failures of deterrence in Afghanistan, failure of deterrence in Ukraine, failure of deterrence in the Middle East, and I think impending failure of deterrence in East Asia. The one thing about Donald Trump was that you did not know what he was going to do. Actually, he didn't start any wars at all. But you have something going for you if people think you're nuts. Richard Nixon's madman theory didn't really work because everybody knew that Richard Nixon, though he might be a crook, was not nuts. But Donald Trump has credibility when it comes to madman theory. So my sense is that the re-election of Donald Trump will probably solve Cold War II to an extent. The Ukrainians will be screwed. Israel will be saved. And Taiwan kind of depends how President Trump feels on the day. If you read John Bolton's memoir describing his brief time as national security advisor, he describes Trump explaining Taiwan to him with the aid of a Sharpie. Anybody read it? It's a completely great scene. Trump's in the Oval Office. John, see this Sharpie? Yes, Mr. President. The Sharpie is Taiwan. See the desk? They all look at the desk. The desk is China, John. And Trump makes a very straightforward argument that it is not worth sending 2 aircraft carrier strike groups across the Pacific Ocean for a Sharpie. So Cold War II will probably be a lot less dangerous if Donald Trump is re-elected. The only small problem is that the Republic will be a goner if he is re-elected. I have very, very limited confidence that the US Constitution can survive a second Trump term. With that, I'm going to pause, invite Andres to join me, and thank you very much for your listening.
Thank you very much, Neil. Well, I promised a good lecture, and I think I stand by my words. That was thought-provoking, challenging. I expect some of you agreed with bits of it, some of you did not, but that's exactly what we do here at the LSA. Before we get into the conversation, maybe just tell people in the room that there are copies of Neil's most recent book outside, courtesy of the Gilded Faithful. And it would be nice to him. He will sign a copy or two, I think. So, Neil, let me begin with China and the Chinese economy. Cold War I did not end in the battlefield. It ended when the world first and the Russians next realized that their economy was really a shack. The Russian economy today has a GDP smaller than Spain, with all due respect to Professor Garicano. I love Spain, but I don't wake up at 2 a.m. wondering whether Spain is a threat to the world, right? So, on China, you gave us mixed messages. On the economy of China, toward the end, you said, oh, demographics, et cetera, will hold them back. But in the beginning of your remarks, you painted a picture of a China that was mighty, growing, powerful, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not a China expert, but I've been to enough China conferences. And the prevailing view among China experts seems to be that, China will continue to grow, but that the monster that one seemed likely to be will not be. The economist in me wants to say we economists don't know a lot, but we do know that no one grows at 7% per year forever. There's such a thing as convergence. The financial expert in me wants to say nobody accumulates so many bad debts in the banking system without having some kind of a blow up. It would not be Argentinian in style, because throughout the financial crisis you need free finance, and China does not have free finance, but something will happen. Bottom line, China will not be growing a lot at the demographics, at the fiscal troubles. So maybe if if evil genius in the back room powering this crisis is an ever-growing mighty China, and we don't have an ever-growing mighty China, might it not be that the problem is not as dire as you described it to be?
Well, it rather depends on what you think the Chinese leadership, which is essentially Xi Jinping, does when confronted by a falling growth rate and rising youth unemployment and a really serious problem in consumer and business sentiment. Now, I was just in Singapore and met with a number of, let's say, well-connected and insightful Chinese who were at the same conference. And I asked them this question. And the standard answer is, no Chinese emperor, and they like to make this kind of analogy, ever resorted to an external conflict because of domestic problems.
No one ever did.
Right. And so this is not the Chinese way. I asked Li Dahui, one of my older friends at Tsinghua, a similar question a couple of months ago at a conference in England. And he said, very insistent, Xi Jinping is not like Vladimir Putin. He's not a risk taker. He's very cautious. He's very risk averse. And the first time he said it, I was inclined to be persuaded. The seventh time he said it, I began to think, he thinks he got protest too much. The two guys are so different, they should spend a lot of time together. And it's probably not because opposites attract. So I think we have to accept that there's some probability that Xi Jinping does use the Taiwan issue to deflect from the obvious and growing problems of China's economy. That's the risk. This is an argument Hal Brands has made, Matt Pottinger has made it, Matt thinks, and I'm not sure I disagree, that Xi Jinping has resolved that China must be ready for war. Bill Burns at the CIA says in 2027, but who knows what the time horizon is. So I think the answer to your question is that this is not a contradiction, that it's precisely China's slowdown and the social problems arising from it that are increasing the geopolitical risk. That the dangerous moment, I think, is now that the model no longer works so well. And the model is kind of crazy. If only my competitors were in charge of Chinese economic policy, I think we'd all be good, because I would just kind of help Chinese consumers go spend more and would slash the fixed asset investment in yet more industrial capacity and yet more coal burning power stations. But my competitors are not in charge of the Chinese economy. Xi Jinping is. And Xi Jinping is creating ever more overcapacity in manufacturing, as if the world's export markets are kind of infinitely elastic. You know, they're now making enough EVs to supply the entire demand of the Western world. So I think it's because rather in a different way, but not entirely different from the Soviet Union, the Chinese model is beginning to break down. It's breaking down in a different way. But as it breaks down, I think the risk of aggression goes up. As when the Soviets began to realize that they're more thing, they became more aggressive. Think of the late 70s when they made those first in Southern Africa, those moves in Afghanistan. I worry that the lessons of Chinese imperial history are totally irrelevant here. The only question is, what does a totalitarian regime do when the wheels begin to come off the economic model? Japan did not go to war because things were going well. Nor did Germany. Read Adam Tooze's book, The Wages of War. Authoritarian or totalitarian regimes, I think, take more geopolitical risk when the economic system begins to underperform.
We're pushing on this just a little bit further. You're saying an impoverished China is more dangerous than a rich China. And that sounds plausible. However, you have to pay for it yourself. And the FT today is a good story on how China was spending money building bridges under the Belt and Road Initiative. And today China is spending money bailing out the companies that misspent that money under the Belt and Road Initiative. So, yes, you increase the risk of crazy behavior, and we'll get to crazy Trump in a minute. But don't you, in the end, need the balance sheets and the growing economic might to, to put the world under your thumb?
Well, you need, if you're going to take on the United States, two things above all. You need to have a really large competitive military, and you need to have the military-industrial base to supply it with ammunition. We've learned in the war in Ukraine just how much the American military-industrial complex has deteriorated, to the point that if there were a war between the United States and China, God forbid, but if it were to happen, the US would run out of precision missiles in a week. So these empty silos are a big concern. In the Pentagon, people are realizing that just buying Ukraine started to drain US stocks of 155 millimeter shells. China can outbuild the US when it comes to shipping. It can outbuild it when it comes to ammunition. It can outbuild it when it comes to a whole range of different things that you would need in a conventional war. It's also really important to notice that China has invested a huge amount of money in its nuclear arsenal. And that gets very little coverage because it's so last Cold War. But guess what? That really matters, because if China has sufficient nuclear weapons to have deterrence, then you can't replay the 1990s Taiwan Strait playbook. So I sense that if one looks at what the regime is doing, wearing my historian's lenses, what I'm seeing is an absolutely classic pattern where a totalitarian regime goes on a rearmament binge, centralizes power in the hands of an even smaller group than before, kind of sits on the private sector to some extent, hence the kind of crack down on power. And this whole thing feels and smells familiar to me. And I think it makes me more worried about Taiwan in January, when the Taiwanese election happens, than most of my China expert friends. And I was more worried about Ukraine in January of 2022 than all my Russia expert friends. So, sometimes being a generalist, which I have been in my career, just helps you with the pattern recognition. Whereas if you're just very focused on one issue, you stop seeing that.
So you predicted that we will not get shelling of Taiwan. The most likely outcome is a blockade of Taiwan.
Yeah, that's that they can do. The invasion scenario, which is what most of the war games are focused on. I mean, the US has done any number of war games on the invasion. The PLA is not ready to do an amphibious invasion of Taiwan. It's really difficult. It's like the hardest thing.
Invasions are difficult. Putin has discovered that recently.
Taiwan Strait is not something that you just kind of sail across. So it's a really difficult passage of water. So I think that whole scenario is for the birds. We know what they're going to do because they keep rehearsing. And if you look at what goes on around Taiwan, that's a lot of naval activity. They just had a whole exercise with
so let me couple your prediction that a blockade is the most likely outcome. with your comment that Biden's foreign policy has been exactly what you said, but let's call it for
much worse than
right.
you would think if you read the New York Times.
All right, so imagine, let's do a little science fiction test. I used to live in New York City and read the New York Times religiously. I do much less nowadays for obvious reasons, but that's a different conversation. That's the dinner time. So we get a blockade. Clearly, the US does not have a lot of pretty options. Biden is still in office. We invite Secretary Blinken to go on a golfing holiday in Florida. We put Niall Ferguson at the wheel in Foggy Bottom. What the hell does one do? What are, you describe the options are limited, but limited options are not the same as no options. What would be your recommendation?
Well, I would begin by sketching the danger to the president of being Khrushchev. Because if you send the naval expedition and you blink, now we know that Khrushchev blinked as part of the deal with the Kennedys, but the deal was not public. So publicly he blinked. It was extremely damaging to Khrushchev's reputation in Moscow, but more importantly, it kind of changed the way that the Soviet leadership thought about the Cold War. It set the Soviets on this massive arms building spree that finally led their arsenal to be larger than the US arsenal. So my recommendation to the president would be don't be Khrushchev. But there's an even worse thing you can do, which is actually to cause World War III. And I know that I'd get through to the president because this is Joe Biden's nightmare. He really, really worries about World War III. It's why he didn't escalate support for Ukraine as much as he might have, because Putin rattled his nuclear saber. It's why he's not pressing Iran nearly as hard as he could right now. So I think I would say, Mr. President, you do not want to get yourself in a situation where the choice is between World War III or human mission.
So I thought
don't send a naval expedition. Don't send a naval expedition.
I thought I was going to get a hockey tantrum from you. I'm getting a double tantrum from you.
I've been a job on this issue 20 years.
All right. So what is the why?
I've been saying to the US policymakers in both parties, do not put yourself in a position when you have to fight for Taiwan and American servicemen and women have to die for Taipei. Don't do that. So don't make Taiwan the Belgium of your World War. I mean, there's a commitment to Belgium, dating back to 1839, that got my grandfather into the trenches on the Western Front for 3 unpleasant years that nearly killed him. So I'm actually a dove on this issue. I'm closer to Trump, much closer than I am to Richard Haas. I said to Richard Haas not long ago, why the hell did you write that piece? You gave everybody permission to be more hawkish in Taiwan at a time when for the first time in many years, the US actually can't credibly threaten to act.
So you told us what not to do. Now tell us what to do.
So you absolutely need to prevent this from happening by making sure that when Biden meets Xi, which is coming up, they talk about this. And instead of, we're going to hit you with yet more restrictions in semiconductors, it's let's restate the one China policy. Let's go back to where we have been since 1972, and let us not have World War III over this island. It is in nobody's interests. It's not in China's interests. Ultimately, it'd be catastrophic for China too. It'd be catastrophic for everybody in this room because the impact on the world economy, even if you weren't dragged into the party, would be huge. So I take a very détente view with this.
And a declining China with all the problems you just described would take that deal or would walk?
I think if you sugar the pill, because you have to do détente is not about let's have a meeting and say words. That is not how it works. You have to have a meeting and talk about stuff that is interesting to the other side. What would be interesting to China right now? Relax the semiconductor restrictions. What would be interesting to China right now? Cut the tariffs. We never talk about that stuff. We send Gina Raimondo to Beijing or Shanghai. We send Janet Yellen. They go there and they say nothing of any interest to their Chinese counterparts. Nothing. That's not détente. What I've learned from writing this Kissinger book is that détente is about transactional discussions with an ideological foe. It's not about appeasing. It's like, okay, we understand that you're the communists and we're the capitalists. What can we discuss? And they did a whole range of things. It's actually quite fascinating to go through the 1970s documents and see how many different initiatives added up to détente. Arms control was part of it. Indochina was part of it. But it's actually easing technology transfer rules. It's increasing trade. It's increasing interactions. The Soviets wanted the technology.
If we were to wheel in Henry Kissinger right now, unexpectedly, would he embrace the sort of policy that you were describing? I suspect yes.
Well, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's been his policy for half a century. And I think if the alternative is brinkmanship of the sort that preceded détente and followed it, because remember we had 62 and then we had 83, I'm more and more persuaded that détente was the right strategy. Remember, détente became a dirty word when Reagan attacked him. Right? But when you look at it again, and this will really be the argument of the second volume, détente allowed the United States 10 years to recover from the fiasco in Vietnam. And in that 10-year period, the United States fixed a lot that got broken in the late 60s and early 70s. And it gave the Soviets time to get out of the road and hang themselves, which they duly did in Afghanistan and elsewhere. And I think if you just avoid the showdown, this would be my advice to any president, Republican or Democrat, avoid the showdown and let the pathologies of their system work their inexorable mischief. You will no longer have so much to fear from China 10 years from now as you do today.
Two quick ones, and then we open it up. I do not want to monopolize the microphone. We haven't said enough about Putin. Let me see if I understand correctly what I think I heard. You said, first of all, Putin went to China and got the rubber stamp. And China's interest is to keep the war as is. If someone wins, the US is no longer engaged, and the West is no longer engaged on that front. So make sure Putin is strong enough to keep fighting, but not so strong as to win. Is that Xi Jinping's strategy in Russia?
I think it is. I mean, one can't really be sure. I mean, I'm pretty sure that there was a green light, and that the meetings and the friendship without limits was a signal. I think from China's point of view, it would have been disastrous if the Russians had lost, because to back a loser is the worst outcome.
You're speaking in the past tense, had lost. That's not a possible outcome?
I think it's very unlikely at this point. There was a moment when the Russians nearly lost, and that was when their armies began to disintegrate outside Kharkiv and Kherson.
Right.
And we narrowly missed the opportunity, I think, there to bring a full breakdown of military order. It was a very close thing. And then Prigozhin mutiny was the last moment when one really wondered if the regime might falter.
So
and I think from a Chinese vantage point, that would have been very bad. The last thing you want is for your best friend. I mean, they have met more than any other two world leaders multiple times over the last decade. So the good outcome from a Chinese vantage point, as I understand it, is this thing keeps going. The Americans get kind of put more and more resources into it that aren't available for Taiwan. They get distracted. They're also distracted now in the Middle East. That's great for Putin. China's like, just don't let the oil price go up. And I think that's a good outcome. Remember, the US, from the US vantage point,
for China,
the Sino-Soviets, if we could only have a Chinese-Russia split again, everything would be thrown. But that's just not going to happen at this point, not with Putin and Xi. On the other hand, it's true that they don't have strong historical alignment. And there are plenty of Russians who think, is all this just leading us into dependency on China? Notice the Chinese are not rushing to build pipelines so the Russians can export their gas.
Not at all. So you're dovish on China, you test your dovishness on Russia. If Russia is in fact the size of Spain when it comes to dollars and cents, defeating Spain would not be impossible. If the Americans and the Europeans really set their mind to it, leave Poland or Slovakia aside for a minute, why not do it?
Well, I think we had an opportunity. And there are two things we could have done that we didn't do. One was just to end the war very quickly after the failure of the Russians to take Kyiv. And I think future historians will realize that there was a huge missed opportunity to end the war at that point, when Zelensky was open to a relatively compromised like peace. I don't think we really know why that did not happen, but I have my theories. The other opportunity I already mentioned, which was when the Russians were absolutely reeling at the end of last year, and we didn't do it. We didn't go in for the kill. In fact, we gave the Russians time to dig in and prepare so that when the offensive occurred, they were ready. Now I think it's extremely difficult to envision what would be needed for Ukraine to win, which would be another upward step in the military technology that we make available. You can't possibly make an offensive like that successful without air dominance. As I was saying, as I was hearing this evening on our recording of Goodfellas with Ben Hodges, you wouldn't send the US Army into an offensive like that without air dominance. So it's really hard for me to see that we can do it now after the Ukrainians have suffered very, very heavy casualties. There's still some probability that there can be victory. I don't think that the Ukrainians themselves have given up. I was in Kyiv in September, and although people were somber compared with a year before, there's still a sense that Russia's beatable, partly for the reason you gave. But also, I think there is still tremendous will to win in Ukraine, and that's a really critical variable in all this. Russia is a kind of colonial power with a colonial army. They sent a lot of people from the boonies to die in these meat-grinding battles. The problem is there's a lot of them that they can continue burning through. And from Putin's point of view, American politics is his get out of jail card. If you look at the polling, Republicans stopped really believing in this war some while ago, and it's decayed.
If they ever did.
No, they did, but they did it first. And it's not surprising how bipartisan support the war had for a year. But the last 6 months or so, it's seen quite a move.
So we could say with Ukraine, but let me ask one last question, which I just have to ask, and then we'll open it up. The mad dog or the mad man theory of governance. There's a London School of Economics who are probably game theorists in the room. You know, game theorists know that there's something called a trembling hand equilibrium. You know, you want a little trembling because you want the other guy to be unsure whether you might not just press the button, right? But the game theorists in the room will also know that you want a little trembling, not too much trembling. You wouldn't put Hugo Chavez, you know, to run American foreign policy. So suppose Trump is back in the White House, and all pollsters are saying that he will. You seem to assume that trembling will be slight and wise. Why do I have the feeling everybody else in the room feels otherwise?
Well, there's been a great difficulty in analyzing Trump as a president because of the Trump derangement syndrome that made all people in all universities almost entirely myopic. Instead of realizing that, in fact, that Trump's first administration had quite a successful foreign policy, people ran around in a state of overexcitement. The Trump administration had a good foreign policy, was successful in a number of ways. He, with considerable help from General H.R. McMaster, my colleague at Hoover, changed U.S. national security strategy on China. Successfully, so successfully that it's now a completely bipartisan position. If you look at the national security strategy of the Obama second term that Susan Rice drafted, it's like, we should just appease China. There's nothing we can do, they're going to take over. It's a terrible document. It's shocking to read it now. Trump changed that, and he had popular support for changing it. He also was able to really put the Chinese under significant pressure. It was working. And interestingly, the Biden administration's only continued it. Complete continuity. Middle Eastern policy far more successful. The Middle East policy essentially led to the Abraham Accords and the isolation of Iran and intense pressure on the Iranian economy. For whatever reason, the Biden people decided to junk that and try and resuscitate the Iran nuclear deal even though it was dead. So if you just judge a presidency by outcomes, not by tweets, I think the Trump presidency was much more successful than George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Joe Biden, all of whom presided over disastrous conflicts, either by intervening in them or just letting them happen. Nothing like that happened on Trump's watch. Trump was able to deter the Iranians far more successfully. Look at the Soleimani hit, which really shut the Iranians up for a bit. So, my sense is that first Trump administration, had a much more successful foreign policy than anybody wants to admit who is a committed hater of Donald Trump. The problem is that the second Trump administration may not be at all like that, because it's not going to have all those establishment military figures that the first Trump administration had in it. No general is going to be within 5 miles of the White House, because Trump realizes that they're all actually closet deep state liberals. So the second Trump administration won't be like the first one. It won't be as chaotic, but it will also be, I think, much more authentically populist and isolationist and nativist. I shudder to think what the domestic consequences will be of his re-election. I wasn't being facetious when I said it would be a threat to the Republic, because I think it will be much more, it can't happen here. It will be much more Sinclair Lewis than 2016-17, where the truth is they didn't expect to win, they had to improvise, and it was essentially a Republican administration with a lot of conventional Republican figures, and, Trump himself causing fire and fury. This will be very different, much more different than people, I think, realize. If you think what they're doing at the America First Institute, they are preparing for power. Their priorities will be domestic. Their priorities will be to purge the deep state of all the things that they felt constrained Trump in the first term. And the response of American liberals, if he wins, will be to deny the legitimacy of his victory as much as he denied the legitimacy of their victory, which was as much as Hillary denied the victory of 2016. And we have this kind of breakdown of legitimacy on both sides. I find this really disturbing, and I fear that if he wins, there will be mayhem in the streets of major American cities, and that mayhem will create opportunities that won't be wasted. There is a scenario in which the wheels come off if he is actually convicted in one of the criminal cases. So it's not like I'm telling you he's going to win, guaranteed 100%. No, I just think the probability is much higher than most people thought. I've been saying for a while it's basically 50%, because he's going to get the nomination. And if he gets the nomination, it's going to be a close election. They always are these days. But I now feel like it's above 50% because he's winning in the swing states, and the Biden administration can't catch a break on the economy. Even when it's going well, they pull poorly. If it goes badly, no president has got re-elected after a recession in 100 years. And he's polling kind of where Gerald Ford was. He's polling where George H.W. Bush was polling. I mean, Biden's a one-term president as things stand, with, I'd say, 55, 60% forward.
I was at an event in the US not long ago, at which a very, very senior American pollster said, and I quote, "Under no conceivable scenario can I envision Donald Trump not being the next president of the United States." And mind you, he was a Democratic person. On that happy note, yes, sir, in the cat there. You were the first. Do we have a microphone or do we not? Or do we not need a microphone?
There's a microphone.
Microphone going your way. Yes. All right.
Thank you for an interesting conversation. I have a question. What do you think are the goals of so-called drivers of this new Cold War II, Russia and presumably Russia and China? Considering that in the Cold War I, Russia wanted primarily, it seems, to have the dominance in the bipolar world. What do you think are the goals for this Cold War II?
It's actually not that straightforward to say what Stalin's goals were at the beginning of Cold War I. There is an argument that his primary concern was the security of the Soviet Union, and he was actuated by a strong sense of insecurity born of the experience of the Nazi invasion. There's a kind of inner logic to Cold War, which you get if you read American Prometheus, which is the wonderful biography of Oppenheimer that then formed the basis for the successful movie. The inner logic of the technological race is very powerful. And I think it's as powerful in the age of AI and quantum computing as it was then. So if you ask what is the motivation in a Cold War, it is insecurity. It is fear that the other side will get what my friend at Google, Hartmut Neven, calls the quantum supremacy. It sounds really good in German. Quantum supremacy. So what if the Chinese get the quantum supremacy? Then all the encryption is gone. We're done. And the Chinese have the same thing. What if the US wins the AI race? We now think, what if their hypersonic missiles can actually sink the aircraft carriers like on day one? So I think that the logic of Cold War is there are two superpowers, two players, which lends it to game theory. And neither trusts the other. And there is a constantly moving technological frontier. And you daren't let the other side cross it. That's what's going on there. And in that sense, it's rational. I mean, I don't want to live in a world in which China is the dominant power, with Russia and Iran and North Korea going, yay, can we play? That is not a world that I want my children and grandchildren to grow up in. I prefer a world in which democracies are dominant. It ain't perfect, but one has some sense that one's individual rights should be protected. That's the logic.
I'm going to take the questions in the order in which I saw hands go up. So the gentleman there in high.
Thank you very much. There's some talk on your podcast and in wider narrative around coordination between this new axis between Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. To what extent, and this might be around the mechanics of how it practically works as well, to what extent is that actual coordination or more being opportunistic about a weaker West? And just kind of, I guess, is this bilateral and how could it be more unilateral when there are divergent objectives?
Thanks. It's an interesting, an important question. When David Frum wrote the Axis of Evil speech for George W. Bush for the State of the Union 2002, he totally made it up. There was no axis at all. I mean, it wasn't like Iran and Iraq and North Korea were on the phone to one another.
I was on David's college class at Yale. He made up a lot of things.
But I don't have any experience of that. But the axis of ill will, which is my coinage, is real. I mean, they are unquestionably in cahoots, as we used to say. I think that the interesting thing about the Xi-Putin meetings, which I think we're now beyond the 24 face-to-face presidential meetings, is that they, I think, have coordinated a plan to end US primacy. I think that is the goal. I think the Iranians are in on it too. One can see that the war in Ukraine has gone wrong for Putin, and he's therefore needed more help than we expected from Iran, and now from North Korea too. So when Kim Jong-un gets in the trade, that's definitely coordination. I think we need to pay more attention to what Xi and others have said. Rush Doshi's book is very good on this. And Rush is now in the administration. There has been openly discussed within the CCP a grand design to end American primacies. It has gone on in the Chinese universities too. And we kind of just didn't pay much attention until recently. And now we have to take them both seriously and literally. The question, I think, gets more complex when there are multiple zones of conflict. So China's not necessarily interested in a full-scale war between the US and Iran in the Middle East because of the impact that would have on oil prices. Whereas the Russians go ahead, make our day. The worse the better. The worse it is in the Middle East, the better it is. So their interests are not perfectly aligned. And I think it's easy for me to imagine that at some point Russian and Chinese interests will diverge. But as long as their eyes are on the prize of ending American primacy, that's a huge prize. My scenario where we bungle it, fail to deter China, do a Khrushchev over Taiwan, they get Taiwan. Can you imagine the humiliation? of an American president having to bargain to keep TSMC open so that the fabs don't stop producing. In China, Xi Jinping is in Taipei. Think about that. Just try and imagine that on the news. That is such an attractive prize that it sets aside the differences between Moscow and Beijing and Tehran.
And in terms of, sorry, so in terms of the kind of
I'm not
mechanics,
sure.
I'm not sure what I'll allow a follow-up because there are many hands up. The lady in the grey over there, you heard us. Yes.
Thank you very much. I was wondering if you think that there are any lessons we can learn from the Cold War and the Cold War II, so that we don't discuss the Cold War III in this room in a couple of decades.
Well, when I first made this argument, I can remember Eric Schmidt being very disconcerted. And it seemed at that point in 2018 quite controversial in Silicon Valley, which had any number of major Chinese investors in town, to say that. But I said, look, I think Cold War II is a good thing because it's better than World War III. So that's the choice. Because the win-win thing is bullshit. The win-win thing is like just not credible. The payoffs are just too asymmetrical. So the choice is Cold War or World War. And if that's the choice, I'll take Cold War. Cold War is a very good thing, right? Very good. Because the United States stops engaging in deranged internal battles and actually focuses on the strategic challenge. Without any kind of external enemy, America is a very divided society. Get focused on the external enemy, things really improve. And then you start actually investing in stuff that you haven't been investing in. So my argument for the Cold War is it's good. How to learn to stop worrying and love the Cold War.
Gentleman in the green over there.
Hi. Can India play a disruptive role
No.
in the Cold War?
All right. Gentleman in the blue right now.
Sorry, it's insufficient.
Elaborate.
In Cold War I, as you know, India was non-aligned. It was in many ways the most important of the non-aligned countries, which I refuse to pick sides, though in many ways it was closer to the Soviet Union than the United States. So the non-aligned was a little bit of a euphemism. Today, and this has been true for 20 years since Von Blackwood, whom I mentioned, tried to make it a part of George W. Bush's foreign policy, we attach a lot of hope in the United States to India as an ally. The Quad is US, Japan, Australia, India. It is not NATO, but it's the nearest thing that the US really has to an alliance that will contain China in Asia. But the problem is, the reason I gave the answer no, I don't think that India really will be an ally. I think India is in a much more transactional relationship with everybody this morning. And they will show up at the BRICS, and Modi will show up in Washington, get feted there. And so I don't really think the non-alignment has changed. The style has changed. Now they're aligned with everybody. But if you're aligned with everybody, it's the same as being non-aligned. So I'm skeptical about how much we can really expect India to do, especially in the Taiwan scenario. They have their own reasons for being at odds with China, but they have very little to do with the Taiwan strait.
On Russia and Ukraine, certainly, India has been ambiguous to say the least.
Well,
although never as embarrassing as Brazil, where Lula has been a complete embarrassment from beginning to end.
I agree, and I just agree with you there, Anders. I thought one of the most embarrassing moments of the entire year in a competitive field was Lula's trip to China, where they just kind of, I mean, he looked like...
Oh, no. There was a much worse moment. A much worse moment when Lula, a human rights activist, a hero of the Latin American left, stated that, in fact, Ukraine was asking for it.
Yeah,
which, as a Latin American, caused me deep shame.
No, but this, in a sense, this illustrates the way BRICS became a kind of vehicle for the axis of ill wills propaganda. I mean, it's interesting. BRICS started out as a Goldman Sachs marketing device, by Jim O'Neill to get golden people to invest in emerging markets, and now it's become part of Chinese propaganda. We have no ideas of these second life.
Very much aided by people who love the phrase global health. It's right now, it would be crazy, but I haven't covered it.
I'm so glad to hear you say that. I have such an aversion to the phrase global south. I wish I could just stop it being used. But I'm a free speech guy, so
as somebody pointed out the other day, the two biggest countries in the global south happen to be in the northern hemisphere. Yes.
Most people live in the northern hemisphere.
And of course, Australia, happen to be in the southern hemisphere, and so on and so forth. Very good. Woman in the lady in the white blanket. Yes, absolutely.
Oh, you just mute that microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Okay. Omar gets the microphone and then back there. Sorry. I happen to know this guy, and I know that he's very tolerant and understanding. Apologies anyway.
Following up on Frank's point, what about the European Union? Because it hasn't been mentioned so far, which is quite surprising.
It's remarkable.
It's remarkable.
We've gone for nearly 90 minutes without mentioning the European Union.
Exactly.
Yes.
The question that follows, does it play, is there any scenarios where it actually plays an important role? Maybe not in Taiwan, maybe not in the Middle East, but at least in Ukraine. Even if the US drops out with Trump in the presidency, is there a scenario where the EU matters?
One of the saddest features of European political debate in the last few years has been the use of the phrase strategic autonomy. I was once at a conference in Italy a couple of years ago when Bruno Le Maire used the phrase and gave a stirring speech in which he said, France, Europe would be a superpower. And he got the biggest round of applause from this mostly Italian audience for European superpower. And I thought, how utterly hollow this is. How utterly hollow. Nobody in this room is remotely serious about doing what you would need to do to have strategic autonomy. And in fact, what the European Union is this kind of institution that refuses to face that reality. NATO mattered much more than European integration in Cold War I. It was NATO that prevented more of Europe going communist. It wasn't the process of European integration, despite many speeches to that effect. And I think it continues to be delusional to talk about strategic autonomy when it would take, I think, about 10 years to get the Bundeswehr anywhere close to being a serious fighting force. So Europe
10 years and about 2 points of GDP a year.
2% points.
Which are nowhere to be found.
Which are nowhere to be found. No, the French talk about strategic autonomy, but they can't even raise the retirement age. So the whole front is utterly.
For the record, nor can most countries.
No, I don't think it's stuff like that. If you want to have the resources to get to your NATO commitment. So there's a huge problem brewing, which is a great source of concern, obviously, at NATO. That if Trump comes in and really this time is no more Mr. Nice Guy. I like seeing the expression "no more Mr. Nice Guy" about Trump. I think he was ever a nice guy. If he really, because remember he was reined in by mass all these people. He went and gave a beautiful speech about NATO's merits in Warsaw. If none of that happens, Europe is going to be left in an extremely weak position. The Poles get it, the people in the Baltic states get it, but I don't think it's really sunk in. And it may take Russian victory in Ukraine to make minds focus enough. But yeah, I mean, the other thing to remember, sorry, I know we're running short of time, that's a really important question. Because of the trans-Pacific nature of Cold War II, Europe is tempted to be non-aligned. The German business community would love to be non-aligned. You can have the same conversations in Berlin that I had in Singapore. It's like, don't have this Cold War, because we want to be friends with China and the US. Can we just not have this Cold War? And this delusion, which is a total delusion, Joe, that you can somehow not be on the US side, I find amazing. There was a Kurber-Stiftung poll that showed, this was admittedly in Trump's presidency, so a few years ago now, the poll showed us, what would you do in the event of a US-China conflict? And a majority of Germans said, we're were like really on China's side. Insane, crazy result, makes no sense. But I think that kind of muddled thinking, just arising from the business interests, has been a characteristic problem. So Europe was much more united in Ukraine than most people would have expected. True, it's totally divided on Israel. In fact, European is so divided on that issue. And on Taiwan, I asked a Macron advisor, what would you do? What would France do? And who would be on the US side in the event of the conflict over Taiwan? And he gave a memorable reply. So, there's the Brits, of course, there's the Australians, maybe Canada. So I think there would be kind of no show in the event that that showed up, as things currently stand. So in answer to the reason I don't talk about Europe is that Europe is kind of geopolitically negligible terms.
Well, Germany, for the record, was a country where the business community wanted to keep buying Russian gas because they said without Russian gas we're toast. And it was an LSE professor, let me think something kind about the LSE, who wrote the paper who said, rubbish, we can do without Russian gas. And he was right, he was wrong. Floor back there, yes.
Yeah, thank you so much. My name is Bogdana, originally I'm from Ukraine, and now I hold position of fellow researcher. And my question is, actually I have two small questions. So recently in the USA and in the UK, Halloween was celebrated, and Blinken, he dressed up his children as Zelensky and as in Ukrainian colors. So do you see some like secret sense in that? And the second question, so what are your predictions, personal predictions, as for occupied territories? As for from my perspective, I see that Russians, they want to make something like buffer zone without people, with the destroyed buildings and without any animals, let's say. So what is your personal opinion?
Well, on Halloween, my younger children dressed up as zombies, which I strongly approve of. And I think it's better not to politicize Halloween, even if you're Secretary of State. Not least because it comes off as slightly late, at a time when you can sense US support or interest waning, not least after the events of October 7th. I think this problem of Ukraine fatigue is the easiest thing to predict about all that has happened since the invasion in February of last year. Because as I argued in a book called Colossus, published 20 years ago, there's an attention deficit disorder problem which bedevils American foreign policy. It is really hard to sustain public interest in anything. In fact, the news cycle is, I saw a paper on this earlier. The news cycle is so remorselessly short that it's really hard to keep a story in the American media for even 4 weeks. And actually, the truth of the matter is that America started to lose interest in Ukraine the night of the Oscars when Will Smith got slapped or did he slap? That was the story. So we mustn't trivialize this conflict. And I felt that Blinken risks doing that. People are dying. I was in Kyiv in September and I met with soldiers who have been in the front line, have lost eyes, they've lost limbs. This is a very, very, very bloody conflict with much higher level of accuracy in weapons than we've ever seen before. Because the technology means that the weapons don't miss the way they used to. It's shocking. We don't know the casualties, but we can get really high, probably as high on the Russian side. We know that they're very high. So I feel very strongly about this. I've fallen in love with Ukraine. I've been there every year for the last 12 years, except 1 year, 2020, when I couldn't go. I have a really close friend there in Slava Bratachuk. It's awful. It's awful. Nothing depresses me more than to see the stillness or deadlock. And I think the Korean analogy is powerful here because you can see the Russian zone of occupation becoming this kind of dead zone, dangerous, poor, just like a large version of the inner Korean border. But let me give you a piece of good news. The lesson, are any people from South Korea here?
Germans.
You can come from two divided. So what is amazing about South Korea, and it's also true of West Germany, but it's even more amazing in the case of South Korea, is that despite the fact that the war did not end conclusively, that it was a stalemate, that the border is this dangerous zone even today, South Korea had the most incredible economic miracle, one of the most remarkable economic success stories of the entire second half of the 20th century. And I keep telling my Ukrainian friends, you can't wait for peace to rebuild what you still control. You can start now, and you can build a hugely successful economy in that large majority of Ukraine that you still control. If they could do it in South Korea, there's no reason why Ukraine cannot be a successful economy. By the way, it's really inspiring to see the innovative entrepreneurial approach that the Ukrainians have taken to this war. It absolutely has blown my mind to see young Ukrainian technologists refining drone technology, improving on things the Americans sent us, and moving the frontier of military capability forward, so much so that I was approached earlier this month by a proposal for a Ukrainian defense tech fund. There are now enough defense tech startups in Ukraine for somebody to raise a fund. So it's not all bad. It's just that we have to get used to the idea that that territory may be lost for a long time. I hope not, but it may be. And in that case, Ukraine has to just focus on defying the Russian threat, the way South Korea defied that threat that's been there all along in North Korea. That crazy regime of crazy regimes. Despite that threat, which continues to this day, the South Korean economy is one of the most successful on the planet.
Thank you so much. I have written papers
Well, at the risk of failing, if I try to paraphrase Neil, but he's rather eloquent as you've seen, maybe we can summarize your last answer by saying the war in Ukraine has been terrible, but the world has been inspired by Ukraine. Yes, I think we have all been inspired by Ukraine. And in a world that is not very inspiring today, those examples of inspiration are to be doubly or triply treasured. So thank you very much.